Our currency is crashing and will soon no longer be the world standard, which will be our greatest defeat, frankly, in 200 years.
Have you ever thought the world trade currency or the US dollar would fall? Have you imagined what world economics would look like if the USD failed? But we are now facing the fall of the economy drastically. But how would BRICS present a threat? Will the BRICS be able to push up the economy? Will it replace the US dollar? Will it have an effect on the West? Let's see. Word of de-dollarization is in the aura. Last month in New Delhi, Deputy Chairman of Russia's State Duma, Alexander Babakov, expressed that Russia is spearheading a new currency's development. It will be employed for cross-border businesses by the BRICS polities: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Weeks later, in Beijing, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva chimed in. Every night he sounded. He questions why all nations have to establish their commerce on the dollar. These developments problematize the description that the dollar's control is sound, because it is the one-eyed money in a land of blind personal foes like the euro, yen, and yuan. As one economist stated, Europe is a gallery, China is a jail, and Japan is a nursing home. He is not mistaken, but a BRICS-issued currency would be. It would be like a new alliance of up-and-coming uneasiness that collectively outweighs the reigning hegemon, the United States, and the entire G7 weight class on the scale of GDP. Foreign nations desiring to extricate themselves from dependence on the US dollar are anything but new. Hums in foreign capitals about a longing to unseat the dollar have made headlines since the 1960s, but the buzz has yet to pivot into results. By one measure, the dollar is used in 84.3% of cross-border dealing, likened to just 4.5% for the Chinese yuan. And the Kremlin's traditional use of falsehoods as an agent of statecraft proposes grounds for suspicion about anything Russia voices. On a litany of functional queries, like how much the other BRICS governments are on board with Babakov's proposition, for now, explanations stay clouded. Nevertheless, at least based on economics, a BRICS-issued currency's prospects for success are new. However, early plans for it are, and many practical questions remain unanswered. Such a currency really could dislodge the US dollar as the reserve currency of BRICS members. Unlike competitors proposed in the past, like a digital yuan, this hypothetical currency can usurp, or at least shake, the dollar's place on the throne. If BRICS used the only brick for international trade, they would remove an impediment that now thwarts their efforts to escape dollar hegemony. Those efforts now often take the form of bilateral agreements to denominate trade in non-dollar currencies like the yuan, now the main trade currency between China and Russia. The impediment? Russia is unwilling to source the rest of its imports from China. So after bilateral transactions between the two countries, Russia wants to park the proceeds in dollar-denominated assets to buy the rest of its imports from the rest of the world, which still uses the dollar for trade. If China and Russia each used only the brick for trade, however, Russia would not have any need to park the proceeds of bilateral trade dollars. After all, Russia would use bricks, not dollars, to buy the rest of its imports. Enter, at last, de-dollarization. It is realistic to imagine the BRICS using only the brick for trade. Yes, for starters, they could fund their import bills by themselves. In 2022 as a whole, BRICS ran a trade surplus, also known as a balance of payments surplus, of $387 billion, mostly thanks to China. BRICS would also be poised to achieve self-sufficiency in international trade that has eluded the world's other currency unions. Because a BRICS currency union, unlike any before, would not be among countries united by shared territorial borders. Its members would likely be able to produce a wider range of goods than any existing monetary union. an artifact of geographic diversity that is an opening for a degree of self-sufficiency that has painfully eluded currency unions defined by geographic concentration, like the Eurozone, also home to a $476 billion trade deficit in 2022. But BRICS would not even need to trade only with each other, because each member of the BRICS grouping is an economic heavyweight in its own region. Countries worldwide would likely be willing to do business in the BRIC. If Thailand felt compelled to use the BRIC to do business with China, Brazil's importers could still purchase shrimp from Thai exporters, keeping Thailand's shrimp on Brazil's menus. Goods produced in one country can circumvent trade restrictions between two countries by exporting to and re-exported from a third country. That's often a consequence of new trade restrictions, like tariffs. If the United States boycotted bilateral trade with China rather than trade in the BRIC, its children could continue playing with Chinese-made toys that became exports to countries like Vietnam and then to the US. American and European governments have prioritized Russia's economic isolation. Nevertheless, some US and European goods continue to flow into Russia. The costs for consumers are real, but not catastrophic, as officials in BRICS countries grow increasingly empathetic about their desire to de-dollarize, with today's Russia as an upper bound of how bad it could get. The risk-reward trade-off for de-dollarization would look increasingly attractive. To displace the dollar as a reserve currency among BRICS, the BRIC also needs safe assets to be parked when not used for trade. Is it realistic to imagine the BRIC finding these? Yes, for starters, because the BRICS runs a trade and balance of payments surplus, the BRIC would not necessarily need to attract foreign money. BRICS governments could use some combination of carrots and sticks to get their own households and firms to buy BRIC assets with their savings and effectively coerce and subsidize the market into existence. But assets denominated in the BRIC would have characteristics likely to make them unusually attractive to foreign investors. Among the major drawbacks of gold as an asset class for global investors is that it does not pay interest despite its risk-reducing value as a diversifier. Since BRICS reportedly plan to back their new currency with gold and other metals with intrinsic value, like rare earth metals, interest-paying assets denominated in the BRIC would resemble interest-paying gold. That's an unusual characteristic. It could make the assets denominated in the BRIC attractive to investors who want both the interest-bearing property of bonds and the diversifying properties of gold. Sure, for BRIC bonds to simply function as an interest-bearing version of gold, they'd need to be perceived as having a relatively low risk of default. And the debt, even of sovereign governments in the BRIC countries, has non-trivial default risk. But these risks could be mitigated. Issuers of debt denominated in the BRIC could shorten debt maturities to lower the riskiness. Investors might trust the government in South Africa to pay you back 30 from now, when the unit of time is days, but not when it is years. Prices could also simply compensate investors for that risk. They could likely get them if market participants demand higher yields for buying BRIC assets. That's because BRIC governments would be willing to pay for the viability of the BRIC. To be fair, the BRIC would raise a litany of thorny practical concerns, used primarily for international trade rather than domestic circulation within any one country. The BRIC would complicate the job of national central bankers in BRICS countries. Creating a supranational central bank like the European Central Bank to manage the BRIC would also take work. These are challenges, but not necessarily insurmountable ones. The geopolitics among BRICS members is also thorny, but a BRICS currency would represent cooperation in a well-defined area where interests align. Countries like India and China may have security interests at odds, but India and China do share an interest in de-dollarizing, and they can cooperate on shared interests while competing with others. The BRIC would not so much snatch the crown of the dollar's head as shrink the size of the territory in its domain. Even if BRICS de-dollarized, much of the world would still use dollars, and the global monetary order would become more multipolar than unipolar. Many Americans are inclined to lament declines in the dollar's global role. They should think before they lament. The dollar's global role has always been a double-edged sword for the US. Though it allows Washington to add sanctions to its foreign policy toolkit, raising the US dollar skyrockets the cost of American goods and services to the rest of the world, decreasing exports and costing the US jobs. But the side that cuts into America at home has been sharpening, and the side that cuts America's enemies abroad has been dulling among those who comprehend that the dollar's global function comes at the outlay of jobs and export competitiveness at bode, at least based on statements from 2014, is Jared Bernstein, now head of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. But these expenses have only increased over time as the US economy shrinks comparable to the world's. Meanwhile, among the traditional benefits of the dollar's global role is America's ability to use financial sanctions to advance its security interests. But Washington sees the security interests of the United States in the 21st century as increasingly defined by competition with state actors like China and Russia. If that is correct, and the checkered track record of sanctions on Russia is any indication, sanctions will become an increasingly ineffective tool of US security policy. If the BRIC replaces the dollar as the reserve currency of the BRICS, the reactions will be varied and bizarre. What do you think would happen? Can BRICS dominate the USD? Will it push back the economy? Comment down if you think the fall of the US dollar is not far away. Until then,